What's up, everybody? So, usage-based pricing. This is a question I get a lot, and usually it's the type of question where, and you know the kind, when people ask the question, they ask it because they want to sound smart. And the implicit assumption is that everybody's doing pricing wrong because they haven't figured out yet that usage-based pricing will solve everything. I do usage-based pricing a lot for a lot of my clients and a lot of my projects. I also don't do it a lot for a lot of my clients and a lot of my projects. So I wanted to go over some of the pitfalls that can block good implementation and of usage-based pricing and the cases when you shouldn't use it. All right, let's get something straight first. Usage-based pricing is when you give the customer access to a solution, they then use it, you then measure that usage and send them an invoice, right? So something happens, a kind of behavior over time, which gets noted, summed, and then billed. Okay, that is usage-based pricing. I won't go into sort of details right now on credit models, which are usage-based pricing charged up front. I have a video on that, so go check that out if you want to do sort of the 2.0 of usage-based pricing. Here, I just want to say that some of the issues that I encounter with usage-based pricing are the following. Number one, seasonal fluctuations. For example, I had a customer, they were selling a usage-based pricing model into agencies or marketing agencies. And it was basically a version of a sort of a cost per click or some sort of that. And what happened was that, it was very campaign driven. So marketing agencies would use this with their clients whenever they had a project, and it would sort of blow up, and it would blow up on Black Friday, it would blow up with Christmas and the holidays, and then it would die down. So during the summer holidays, there would be almost no usage and so forth. And I've seen this in maritime and shipping as well, and in any other type of industry where there just is a lot of seasonality. This can be okay if you have the balance sheet to just, walk through the seasonality and not essentially earn any money in, half of the year or earn all of your money in a very specific time period. But maybe you don't want that. So I was just seeing that a lot of times what happens is that usage-based pricing then gets into sort of weird hybrids where either because the company can't sort of survive the high fluctuations in revenue and cash flow, what they will do is they'll say, you need to commit to this usage on a monthly period and so forth. Unless you actually can weather the full cycle of usage with the customer, maybe you shouldn't do usage-based pricing if there is a lot of cycle going on and a lot of seasonality. Okay, that's number one. Two, lack of user control. So usage implies that there is a user that does the usage. And most of the time, this is true. But when selling into a lot of different kinds of, let's say, customer entities like big corporations and so forth, there is a wide range between who's actually using the software and who is paying for it. So sometimes you can say, we're gonna buy this, and then we're gonna give the tool to the developers, and then the developer starts hammering away on API calls or whatever the usage-based pricing is, and then suddenly the bill runs up. Or you can even move the usage out into a sort of a second, further removed from the user or the buyer, which is, whenever there is API calls between these systems, so between us and our sort of third-party software and so forth, we pay, and of course, those third parties can then be responsible for the usage, or it can be the client's customers, and so forth. So there can be a lot of users that aren't actually sort of within the domain of control of the customer, which can create a lot of anxiety because it creates unpredictability and so forth. Part of this is with, let's say, rightfully, that the customer is saying, I'm paying the bills, so if I was the user, I would use it responsibly. But if I put usage out into, the hands of someone else, let's say my staff, implicitly, I don't trust my staff, but okay, that happens. They will not use it responsibly. So they will hammer away and create a lot of different, let's say, accounts or active users and so forth. So I think Figma had this problem at one point where it was sort of whenever someone is sort of actively tagged as an, I can't remember what it was, like it wasn't a commenter, but it was like someone who had access to edit a project, they would be charged on a user space price based on active users. And the problem was that everybody in the organization could tag everybody else as editors. I can't remember what the term was, but was something like an editor, which means that whenever someone would see, oh, we have a project here, like whatever, 50 people involved, but only 5 editors, but I can just like let everyone edit. Isn't it easier? So I'll just like tick off like the other 45 people, and suddenly the Figma bill would just blow up 10 times. So massive issue, blowback, had to change it into sort of a more controllable model for the buyer because the usage was out of control of the customer, which leads us into the third bullet, which is budget constraints. So you are going to have types of buyers which aren't actually going to be able to participate in the value that is being generated. And this can have sort of details that are oriented with it around exactly what do we mean by usage-based pricing. Because sometimes it isn't the act of using something. Sometimes we are actually just measuring an event. So I would say that, let's say that the event is a third-party API call coming in, and that is being charged for some reason. Okay, that is usage, but it isn't a behavior. So nobody actually did that. So we're calling it usage-based pricing, but really it was an event that we measured. Something else could be, I did a project once for someone that did shopping mall software, and they would charge based on footfall. So they would go to the shopping mall and say, hey, depending on footfall, we will, charge you for it was a marketing solution. And the shopping mall marketing department was the one buying this, and they would say, well, we don't care because we don't get bigger budget just because you double the footfall. Because our budget is controlled by the rent that the stores in the shopping mall pays to us. So we get, say, 2% of that is the norm. And if you double the footfall, all the stores make more money, but it will take us 3 to 5 years to turn that increased retail revenue into higher rental revenue and into more budget. So if you just have a lot of success with creating footfall, you will essentially bankrupt us from a department perspective. And they couldn't really get around this, so they had to put in controls and not create a truly use-based model in this instance. So budget constraints can be real. You have it again with RFPs, with government tenders. You have it with if you're selling, let's say, into oil and gas, where the software is to be used for a specific project duration. They say, oh, we're going to drill here and it's going to be for 6 years. That's it. And we want to know sort of the entirety of the total cost of ownership of the project and so forth. So you can have a lot of these issues where the budgets and the way that the customer's economics are set up, they just don't want to do usage-based. And sometimes they will tell you right up front to say, if you present us with a usage-based model, we are going to decline, and go with something else. You shouldn't always take that for granted. Sometimes there is wiggle room. Sometimes you can create a better type of usage-based model. Sometimes customers just burned with, ill-designed usage-based models in the past, so you can't bypass that. But sometimes you can't. And then, come up with something else. The fourth point is that sometimes for usage-based models, they don't monetize that well. And this is sort of a longer point, but let's just imagine that you're measuring something, right? And that something for one customer is worth $1, and that something for another customer is worth $1 million. So what is your price point going to be? $500,000? So if you charge $500,000, you'll sell to one customer only, because the one where it's worth $1 will just not buy. And the one where you sold it for $500,000, well, they will have gotten a really good deal. So you are actually priced wrong if you do an average, right? So this is just to illustrate that depending on what your solution does and who it does it for, the usage-based pricing can vary quite a bit with the kind of value that it delivers per unit of usage. So sometimes this can be remedied by choosing another metric to price on. So, instead of API calls, we're going to price based on storage, or we're going to price based on whatever, something else. But you still have this issue where if you're selling into, let's say you're selling to retail, and you're selling into very low margin retail and into very high margin retail. So I have had a lot of clients who does that, and that could be with catching counterfeit goods or with doing supply chain visibility and so forth. And here we just have issues that one unit of goods, let's say that is, or for custom software and so forth, one unit of goods for one company can be worth a lot of money. Let's say you're doing automotive parts, which is sold on Amazon and Craigslist and so forth, and each one can be hundreds and hundreds of dollars with high margins, maybe thousands. Or you're doing fast-moving consumer goods where you're usually selling something for 10 or 20 bucks, right? So the variance or the density of the value in the unit can be highly dependent on this. What most usage-based models do is, if they are relatively broad, they have to work on some sort of a cost-plus basis, meaning that I'm so early in the value chain that the customer is just going to see me as a cost input, and then they, in their business, will create the value out. So this is the case with Azure and all the cloud solutions, so forth. They're just selling you API calls or storage or whatever, processing power, whatever it is. And they don't really care what you use it for. Some people use it poorly, make no money. Other people make like huge, very profitable business stuff. But Azure doesn't go in and price that difference. They're just saying, well, we're just the gas, and whatever car you drive, that's on you, right? So sometimes if you're starting out and have a usage-based model, you can see that you're standing there at your gas station, and then a Volkswagen a Beetle is coming up, and you pour gas in that, and then a Ferrari pulls in, and you're putting gas in that, and say, hey, these customers are getting very different kind of value out of the gas I provide in the market. And this is essentially where you need to figure out, are you just a gas station, or do you want to go into the Ferrari market and provide something very specific to these guys? Which usually means that you should reposition the product and also reposition your usage-based pricing to something that is very Ferrari specific, right? So you're going to say, well, we are going to charge based per Ferrari, whatever it is, or per Ferrari mile. Fifth bullet is that sometimes in a venture context and in a fundraising context, you need a historical track record in usage-based pricing to really be able to raise money off of it. So from a cash flow perspective and from a business history perspective, it can be harder to get off the ground compared to license-based models where you essentially say you buy X amount of usage rights, and whether you use them or not, that's up to you. So I'm selling you 10 seats, and if you only create 8, that's up to you. You'll pay for the 10. So if you have usage-based and it fluctuates the seasonality and your customers start small and grow over time, taking that initial business case and say, hey, we have users, they are using it, it is growing, to a venture fund and saying, or an investor, and saying, hey, we really need you to fund this because the customers aren't yet. So that discussion can be harder with usage-based pricing. Because of all the great examples of usage-based models that have worked and created unicorns and so forth, it is getting easier, but there still is, like, if you just have the cash flow and you just have the ramp up and you have the predictability, the spreadsheet just becomes much easier for these customers to make. And I would also say that this idea with usage-based pricing that, oh, it's going to happen in the future, usually actually only works for your pre-seed, seed, and Series A. At Series B and plus, the venture cases, they just want to see the math. They just want to see, where do these customers end? How fast do they grow? What's the net dollar retention? What can we do to make them grow faster and so forth? And then it just becomes pure numbers. And at this point, usually they actually don't care about whether you're using a use-based model at all. They just care about dollars at top line and dollars at bottom line and growth rate. So you're not selling them the model at this point anyways. So if you haven't gotten it to work when you are at, let's say, 5 or 10 million ARR and sort of work in the sense that you have all the history and you are sort of starting to create positive cash flow, it's going to get really hard to get funded at a later stage, unless you're, of course, there are exceptions to everything. The last bullet, let's say, of weakness I have with usage-based pricing is that it is super trendy, right? So it has a lot of popularity, a lot of people using it. And so in the beginning I said, well, I heard you talked about pricing, so I have just the thing for you. You just do usage-based pricing, and then all your woes will be fixed, right? And you get this a lot. And true, the idea is that some people hear this, say, oh, this is great, we'll use it in our business, it works perfectly, they have a really good case to do usage-based pricing on, and it blows up. And then they conclude that usage-based pricing just will work for everyone, right? And this is where it gets tricky because it won't. And for some people, there just are, the cash flow is harder to get off the ground. There is a lot of seasonality. The usage and user are separated and so forth. They have budget constraints. They're selling into sort of various enterprise where usage-based pricing isn't going to work, yada, yada, yada. So it's going to fail. And because they are so convinced that usage-based pricing is right, they're unwilling to review it and back down on it because it has become a belief. Instead of just being, say, hey, usage-based pricing is an option, it's a tool. We'll see if it's right for us in this case. If it's not, we'll do something else.